So hey everyone, today we'll be talking about script writing and how to find your process. Consider the time of day, the weather, and the date. Also make sure to include objects that will be used later on in the book early. So for example, like let's say you have this talisman, which is going to be really important later on, but you need to kind of foreshadow it at the beginning. Make sure you mention it at the beginning in the room that it's going to be instead of later on, so the illustrator doesn't have to go back and draw that in. Also, try to avoid lengthy text and too many panels. Really depends. It depends on, are you writing middle grade, young adults, adults? Each of those kind of have different lengths of how many panels you might be able to include just based on the size of the book. But in general, from what I've been told, like try not to go over like a 10 max. There are exceptions, of course, and usually the sweet spot is like 6 or below, especially if you're doing like a middle grade. But again, it changes from genre to genre. Just try not to make text super, super long. Also, make sure you mention how many people or objects are in a scene, especially for establishing shots. Like for an example, let's say the parents are driving the main character on the road. Is there traffic? Is there not traffic? Like you want to make sure you specify that so the illustrator knows how to portray. Because if you don't mention that and all of a sudden they think it's a no traffic scene and it becomes traffic, that could completely change the expressions of the characters and how they're interacting. Also make sure to use description actions, not just what they're doing, but how they're doing it. So for an example, is somebody walking or somebody skipping? Like that slight difference in wording can really mean a lot on the illustrator end. And then another thing you can do, this is totally optional, but you can paste URL links for clarity. It's something that I've done. I wanted to share a medical treatment process within my book. So I literally just linked a YouTube channel and a specific YouTube link within my script, and it helped my editor visualize what I was going for. So you can totally do that. Like maybe there's an image or something. I've done it for video games as well. It's like this scene in a video game is kind of the vibes I'm going for. So, feel free to add links for clarity if you need it. Another thing that we did at suggestion of my agent was we created a plot board, and I created this in Miro because it's a really great kind of online whiteboarding tool that gives you a lot of functionality. Basically what a plot board is, it includes all of your key story beats throughout your entire story and what's kind of known as, like a sticky note. So I actually started off with the Save the Cat story structure. And then each of the sticky notes is actually for different storylines. So for an example, a pink could be anything that's related to romance, or maybe in my case, I have a medical storyline. So anything in green might be medical. So this is a really great way of kind of seeing your entire book in a visual format. And the other great thing about using Miro in particular is that people can leave comments on it and move things around. So PDFs can be a bit challenging sometimes because usually you can only leave comments and, you're more limited in what you can change. But with Miro, you can quickly, switch up a sticky note, add a new one in really easily, and then your agent can leave comments, which is really, really helpful. So just a few comic style formats. There's a ton of them. One of them is the standard comic scripts. There's also the Dark Horse format, which you can see in the middle, and then the Fred Lente's format over on the right-hand side. These aren't the only ones. There's so many different ones, but you can kind of peruse and see which one might work best for you. Another thing to note is who you submit to can also dictate the format. So for example, if you want to be published by Dark Horse, you should write in the Dark Horse format. So and oftentimes publishers will have guidelines on their website, especially at least in traditional comics. So just to kind of break down the anatomy of the comic script, but basically you have a couple of different sections. So you have your page heading, your panel number and description, whoever your speaker is, or if it's a caption, then you'll usually get into your dialogue. And then if you have any kind of sound effects, that's another part of it. So to kind of show you a couple things you can do. So over on the right-hand side, I've kind of shown, at least within my manuscript, how I typically will add these letter directions. But basically what you can do is after the character's name, you can say how you want the visual to look for the speech bubble, for example. So let's say, I want to shout, which you can see on the upper right, then I know I'm going to use the shout speech bubble once they start illustrating. If something's going to be off panel, I can put off or off panel. If you want to add things like a sound effect, so oftentimes you can write in just SFX, and then you can specify what object is doing the sound effects. And another thing, and this is actually a tip from my editor, is that you can specify who you're doing that action, or rather the talking to, that's not clear in your description. So let's say you have like 3 people in a scene, and in your description, it's not clear that one of them is speaking to another person. You could say something like, character A, or in this case, Carrie, to Ari. You could also do like things like, oh, Carrie whispers to Ari, just to make it very, very clear for your editor who this character is talking to if there's a lot of people in a group. You can see a couple more, which I've illustrated on the left. So captions are usually kind of telling you what the setting is. So maybe it's like the time period, time of day, meanwhile, all those things are generally in a caption. Thought, which usually has a thought bubble, shout, or some people might use burst instead of shout. You can do whisper, opera panel, as I mentioned, singing. So you might have musical notes, VO, which is voiceover. So maybe you're not seeing the character on the page, but they're still speaking. Oftentimes in manga, you'll generally see like a little character kind of in the bubble. You might not need that, it depends. And then the final one is for sound effects as well. Another thing that you might want to consider when you're writing a script is to add camera movements and shots. However, I do recommend that if you end up doing this, be cautious, because if your agent or editor isn't familiar with the film world and some of these terms, it could get confusing, especially if you have a lot of them. So if you do end up using them, what I usually suggest is use the more commonly well-knowns, which we'll talk about in a sec, and also use them very sparingly. Usually you only want it for something that's a little bit more impactful for a panel. You don't want to do this for every panel, but maybe you'll sprinkle it, once every few panels or whenever it's important to include. So you can kind of see on the left-hand side a few of them, which tend to be a little bit more commonly well-known ones. So zoom in and zoom out. Panning is basically you're shifting the camera over. Tilting is like you're tilting the camera. So you can kind of like envision all of these guidelines. Like if you had a camera that was looking at your comic page, how is it identifying that specific panel? So other things that are pretty common to include are establishing shots. So if you're setting up a setting, or full charts is when you can see the full body. If you're curious about some of the other terminology, for example, you don't know what dolly or truck is, you can go to this really great website, which kind of lists out a lot of the camera movements and shots, which could potentially help you. But again, I would try to avoid too complex ones just because your agent or editor might not know. But yeah, I know it was a lot of info to get through. I hope it was very helpful.